Welcome back. We're continuing with proving validity or invalidity by truth table, and now we're going to deal with a monstrously big problem and determine whether this argument 78 is valid or invalid by truth table. Since there are 4 statement constants, f, p, q, and z, we need 2 to the 4th, which is 16 lines. 16 possible interpretations to determine, to come up with all the possible combinations of truth values for the parts. So let me fill those in quickly. Remember our pattern: true, false, 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 true, false. When we move over, we double it, so we have 2 trues, followed by 2 falses, 2 trues, 2 falses, 2 trues, 2 falses, 2 trues, 2 falses. We move over again, we need to double the pattern again, so now we're up to 4 trues before we switch to 4 false, back again to 4 true, and 4 false. Now, as we move over to the last one, we're going to double again, so instead of 4 trues, it's 8. Followed by 8 false. And this gets us all the possible combinations of truth values for the different statement constants. All right, let's try to determine whether this argument is valid or invalid. And the way we kind of try to do this is by proving it's invalid, which means we should calculate the conclusion first. Line 1, f is true and z is true, so the conclusion would be true. Line 2, f is true and z is false, so this would be false. Line 3, f is true and z is true, so the conclusion is true. Line 4, f is true, but z is false, so this is false. Line 5, f is true and z is true, so the whole thing is true. 6, f is true, z is false, so the whole thing is false. 7, f is true and z is true, so the whole thing is true. 8, f is true and z is false, so the whole thing is false. And now, look, interpretations 9 through 16, f is false, and a conjunction is false if any part of the conjunction is false. So I know that the rest of all of these are going to be false. All right. Now remember, we're looking for a case for true premises, false conclusion, which means we can eliminate the cases where the conclusion ends up true. Unfortunately, there's not many of them. Line 1 was true, line 3 was true, line 5 was true, line 7 was true, and then, gosh darn it, all the rest were false. So let's calculate the remaining interpretations. I'm on interpretation 2, not P or Q. P is true, Q is true, so or would be true, but we have to negate it, so the first premise ends up being false. And since it's false, we're not interested in this line. We're done working with that line. So let's move on to line 4, interpretation 4. Here, P is true, Q is false. The or makes this true, and then the not makes the whole thing false. So I can eliminate this line as well. So I'm already down on interpretation 6. P here is false and Q is true, which makes the or true, but we have to negate it, which makes the first premise false, and therefore we're not interested. All right, we're down to interpretation 8. P is false and Q is false, so we have false or false, which is false, and that gets negated, so the first premise here is true. Since it's true, well, we need to continue calculating the rest of the premises. All right, so I'm looking at this premise now on interpretation 8. Not P is the antecedent, and so P here is false, so the antecedent ends up being true because we have to do not P, and Z on this line is false. So if we do the conditional true then false, we end up with false, which means we can eliminate this line from contention. So we're on interpretation 9 now. On 9, P is true and Q is true, so the disjunction is true, but we have to negate it. So the first premise ends up being false, and therefore we can eliminate this line. Remember, we're searching for a line, an interpretation where all the premises turn out true and the conclusion is false. So one false premise means that we need to eliminate that entire interpretation, that entire line. Okay, interpretation 10, P or Q. P is true here, Q is true here, so we get true for the disjunction, but we have to negate it, so we get false, and that allows us to eliminate 10. On to 11. P here is true, Q is false, the or makes it true, and the negation makes the premise false, which means we can eliminate this one. 12. P here is true, and Q is false, which gives us a true disjunction, and we negate it, so the premise ends up being false, and we can eliminate that interpretation as well. 13, P is false and Q is true, so the disjunction is true, but we have to negate it. So we get false, and we can eliminate this one. On to interpretation 14. P here is false, and Q is true, so false or true is true, but we have to negate it, which means we get the first premise is false, so we can eliminate that. 15, P here is false, and Q is false, so we have false or false, which is false, and then we negate it, and we end up with true. So we are still interested in this one, because the first premise came out true. Let's look at the second premise. P is false, so not P would be true, and Z here on line 15 is true, so what we have is true, then true, which is true. Okay, so premise 2 came out true as well, so we're still interested. We need to go to the last premise, F then Q. F is false, Q is false, so false then false we know is true. So look what we have here. Premise 1 is true, premise 2 is true, and premise 3 is true, and yet the conclusion is false. So we now know that this argument is invalid, and we can point to line 15 or interpretation 15 as showing it's invalid. If we found no such line, of course, we would say the argument is valid, but we did. Hope this